Over the weekend, the Republican Party in Texas finalised its official party platform via a convention in Houston. While the Texas GOP are notoriously right-wing, not many commentators expected the platform to be quite as extreme as it was, with controversial clauses on everything from election integrity, homosexuality, and even Texan secession, which they want a referendum on next year. So, in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the platform, what it actually says, and what it can tell us about the state of American politics more generally. Before we start, a bunch of our viewers didn't know that we actually have other YouTube channels. You can find much more news from us if you head over to TLDR UK, EU and Global. Subscribe to the channels you're interested in, or just all of them to get the most from TLDR and stay in the loop. They're linked below. So, before we get into the meat of the platform, a bit of context. The National Republican Party oversees state party affiliates in all 50 states, which are tasked with promoting Republican principles and supporting Republican candidates within their jurisdiction. While these groups are affiliated with the national GOP, state party organizations are not subject to direct control by the national party, which means they've got a fair amount of freedom as to how they operate. The Republican Party branch in Texas, officially known as the Republican Party of Texas and legally considered to be a political action committee, holds their own state-level conventions every 2 years. At these conventions, policy platforms are decided upon by state-level delegates, which are basically grassroots Republicans who are elected by other Republicans at lower-level conventions. Policy platform is composed of various planks. Planks are basically mini-statements or policy proposals which are voted on individually by the delegates, assuming they're approved by the platform committee composed of 31 senior Texan Republican officials. There are about 9,600 eligible delegates, but usually only about half of them turn up, and they usually vote in favour of just about every plank that's approved by the platform committee. Now, it's worth noting that this platform document is not legally binding for Republican lawmakers, and is best understood as an expression of the most activist grassroots views in Texas's Republican community. Previous platforms have been remarkably extreme. The 2020 platform, for example, included a plank that deemed carbon credits unconstitutional and called for an end to the minimum wage. But they're often ignored by the state legislature, which has been controlled by Republicans since the early 2000s. Nonetheless, even acknowledging the caveat that these platforms don't usually become policy, this year's platform has been particularly extreme. There's actually so much in this year's 40-page document that it's kind of hard to present, so we're just going to go through a bullet point list of all the noteworthy planks. Strap in, because there's quite a few of these. If you can't be bothered to hear all of them, then check the description for some timestamps so you can just skip to where the list ends. Plank 21 calls for the repeal of Texan Code 418, which allows the state government to declare a state of emergency and a complete ban on both lockdowns and contact tracing. Plank 31 calls for the return to Christian teachings in education and government. Plank 32 calls for what looks like a complete deregulation of gun laws in the US. Plank 33 calls for a referendum on secession in the next Texas legislative session, due in 2023, citing an impairment of the right to self-government by the federal government. Plank 34 calls for a state electoral college, which would presumably give more electoral power to rural Republicans. Plank 36 calls for the complete abolition of abortion. Plank 42 calls for the abolition of the Environmental Protection Agency, the scrapping of the Endangered Species Act, and defunding of, quote, climate justice initiatives. Plank 51 calls for the repeal of the minimum wage, maternity and sick pay, the Consumer Protection Act, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which requires companies to publish certain financial records, and the Lacey Act, which prohibits trafficking of listed fauna and flora. Plank 56 basically tries to ban, quote, woke corporations from operating in Texas. Plank 82 and 83 call for getting rid of basically all major taxes, including income tax. Plank 90 calls for the end of the property tax. Plank 99 calls for the abolition of the Federal Reserve. Plank 111 rejects, quote, critical race theory as a post-Marxist ideology. Plank 143 describes homosexuality as an abnormal lifestyle choice. Plank 144, quote, opposes all efforts to validate transgender identity and calls for a ban on any transgender-related medical treatment for anyone under 21. Plank 151 describes pornography and paedophilia as public health hazards in the same breath. Plank 152 calls for a ban on any coercive medical policies like mandatory vaccinations. Plank 192 calls for the repeal of all hate crime laws, which doesn't sound great, and to be fair, neither do many of these. Plank 213 calls for the nullification of the Supreme Court's Obergefell v. Hodges decision, which paved the way to same-sex marriage. Plank 244 calls for the repeal of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which prohibits racial discrimination in voting. Finally, Plank 273 calls for the US's withdrawal from all United Nations and all associated bodies. The last page has a resolution which rejects the result of the 2020 presidential election. All in all, pretty wild stuff. As we said before, this isn't legally binding, so it's unlikely, for example, that Texas will actually hold a secession referendum in 2023. And some of the media hysteria around this story has clearly been unwarranted. Nonetheless, this shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. The rise of Trump and the corresponding weakening of the Republican Party establishment has made Republican lawmakers more responsive to grassroots sentiment than ever before. Just look at last year's legislative session, where Republican lawmakers passed a heartbeat abortion law, removing basically all restrictions on carrying handguns, and only failed to pass an extreme voting reform bill when House Democrats walked out to deny them the required 100-member quorum. Ultimately, this is all a symptom of a wider problem in American politics: the two-party duopoly. The Democrats' current unpopularity, combined with the fact that Texan lawmakers lean Republican, means that state Republicans can basically say whatever they want in their platform without incurring any electoral risk. More parties would mean more electoral pressure, thereby forcing politicians to adopt more moderate policies in order to win power. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to subscribe to TLDR US. Remember, you can get a whole lot more from TLDR by making sure you're subscribed to our other channels too: TLDR UK, EU and Global. Thanks for your support.